Have you ever wondered what it would be like if your own parents decided to give everything they had to one child and to the other just a cold sentence like, "Go earn your own money"? It seems impossible until it happens to you. When the office door closed behind me, I smelled the old carpet, heard the wall clock ticking away, and saw my sister's eyes shining with the promise of $10 million. The lawyer could barely hide his discomfort. It all happened so quickly. But some details will never leave my mind. My parents' blank expressions, the pile of papers on the desk, the feeling that I no longer belonged in that family. It wasn't just the money. What happened there completely changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, envy, and survival within one's own home. But none of this makes sense if you don't know what my life was like before that day. When the door closed behind me in that stuffy office, everything seemed to stop. It was January 25th, 2023, a typical Thursday for almost everyone. But for me, that was the day life began to fall apart, even if I didn't yet understand why. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old, and I was born in Sacramento, California, but grew up on a farm outside Fresno. I've always felt a bit out of place in my family, mainly because I was never like my sister, Ashley, who seemed to be born knowing exactly what to do to please our parents, David and Linda. At school, I wasn't the popular girl. I always preferred to stay in the science lab or lose myself in books, while Ashley excelled in horseback riding competitions and school events. It was as if there were two worlds in the same house, hers, surrounded by praise and attention, and mine, quieter, with small victories that almost no one noticed. My grandfather, Henry, was the only one who truly saw who I was. He worked as an agricultural researcher, and whenever he could, he'd take me to the old laboratory he kept in the back barn. There, he taught me how to care for the plants, showed me the soil testing equipment, explained the purpose of each test tube, and let me record the results of the experiments in an old notebook I still have. He was the kind of person who didn't say much, but when he looked me in the eye, I knew I could trust him. My grandmother, Margaret, on the other hand, was strict, the kind who didn't accept vague answers and wanted everything in its place. But she had a quiet tenderness that showed in small gestures, like when she made oatmeal cookies every Friday night because she knew they were my favorite. My father always kept to himself, spending more time solving farm problems than sitting at the dinner table. My mother was practical, the kind who solved everything with lists and notes on the refrigerator door, but rarely stopped to ask if I was okay. Growing up in this routine taught me to depend on myself and not wait for someone else to show up to solve things for me. I graduated from the University of California, Davis, with a degree in biology and spent 4 years working on a soil fertility research project. It was technical work, but it made me feel part of something bigger. I returned home in 2022 when Grandpa fell ill. The farm looked the same from the outside, but it was strange to see how small changes in the environment revealed the time I'd spent away. The shed, once full of tools, was now half abandoned. The laboratory covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one cared anymore. My parents didn't talk much about Grandpa's illness, only saying he needed rest and that everything was under control. Ashley rarely showed up, always busy with her new job in San Diego and international travel. I missed those times when we were kids and competed to see who could pick the most pumpkins before sunset. Still, I tried to adapt. On the farm, the days started early. At 5:30 a.m., the alarm would ring, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee would fill the kitchen. My father was already in his boots, heading off to check on the animals. My mother was silently preparing breakfast. The television in the living room always broadcast the same local news. My routine was to divide my time between helping with the housework and paying attention to my grandfather, who insisted on leaving the room to show me some new experiment. Even though he was already weak, he didn't like to stay still. I tended his plants, jotted down the data he asked me for, calibrated old equipment, and tried to understand the formulas and spreadsheets he left scattered across the table. Sometimes I felt like at any moment it could all disappear, and I'd be forced to face a life without anyone who truly knew me. It wasn't an easy life, but there was an honesty in every detail of that routine, in the small daily victories that almost no one saw. I knew that, there, at least in the lab, there was a corner of my world where I could be myself without having to fight for space. Nothing prepared me for what was about to happen in that office room. As I sat at the dark wooden table, I took in every detail: the lawyer's gold pen, the sound of the clock striking 8:15 a.m., the bright light streaming through the curtains. Ashley smoothed her blonde hair, adjusting the expensive bracelet on her wrist, and smiled as if this were all a private party. My parents remained silent, exchanging quick glances. The lawyer organized the papers, cleared his throat, and asked everyone to pay attention. Now imagine, you're sitting at this same table, surrounded by people who've always pretended to know you, about to hear something that could change everything forever. What would go through your mind? Write in the comments what you would feel realizing your life was about to be turned upside down, right there, without warning. Or, if you've ever had a similar experience of being left out or facing injustice, share your story here too. At that moment, I thought I knew what injustice was, but that was just the beginning of the nightmare. The lawyer held up a large envelope, placed it on the table, and began reading my grandfather's will. I tried to remain calm, but my hands were cold. Mr. Harris was direct, unwilling to beat around the bush, and he quickly explained that there were clear instructions for dividing the inheritance. He read my grandfather's words firmly, and all I could think about was the strong smell of that office, filled with antique furniture and piles of paperwork. Suddenly, he announced, in the driest voice I'd ever heard, "Ashley will receive a check for $10 million. For a second, everything stopped for me. $10 million. He repeated it again, without a tremor in his voice. I glanced at the shiny bracelet on my sister's wrist and saw the wide smile she was trying to hide. My father straightened his coat. My mother shuffled through the papers as if this were routine. My legs felt heavy under the table. All I could think about was the number, $10 million. Never, in 31 years of life, did I think I would hear such a phrase directed at someone sitting next to me, especially said as if it were a simple bank announcement. I stood there, motionless, waiting to hear something about what would be done with me. The lawyer finished the part about Ashley, turned the page, and paused briefly before looking at me. The silence grew awkward. My mouth felt dry. It wasn't just the lack of water. It was the accumulated embarrassment of years. My parents, without taking their eyes off me, spoke in unison, almost rehearsed. "Rachel, it's time to earn your own money." There was no explanation, not a single word of comfort, just the sentence. The lawyer said nothing, not even a nod. I looked back at my sister, who couldn't hide the glint in her eyes, and then at the scattered papers. Each sheet seemed heavier than it actually was. The clock on the wall read 8:26 in the morning. We'd been sitting there for a little over 10 minutes, but I already felt tense. I wanted to ask if there had been a mistake, if any documents were missing, but no one moved a muscle. The sound of the ancient air conditioning was all that could be heard. I could hear the lawyer's pen tapping on the tabletop, a light, almost imperceptible tap, but it hammered inside my head. I felt my stomach churn. The weight of that sentence from my parents was greater than all the money they could give or take. The feeling of being judged by an audience that knew exactly what was about to happen, except me, made my palms sweat. The room had beige walls, brown curtains, and a bookshelf filled with law books, all very old but tidy. There was a crooked painting of a landscape, probably bought at a thrift store. It wasn't a place for happy endings, I thought, but I never imagined I'd leave there so scarred. No words of support, no look of someone who understood that this was too hard for a daughter to hear from her own parents. Just the cold sentence, piercing any protection I'd built up over the years. I tried to swallow, but it felt like the air wouldn't pass. I wanted to leave, disappear, pretend I hadn't heard, but my chair felt stuck to the floor. My parents chatted quietly, discussing Ashley's bank account, naming the exact number without any embarrassment. $10 million. It was as if they were discussing the week's grocery list. No one asked how I was feeling. No one thought it was strange to leave me there, with nothing, in front of the lawyer and my own family. Ashley fixed her hair, picked up her phone, and checked her messages while the lawyer began to gather the papers. To them, it was all natural, another rational decision, almost a business deal. To me, it was something else. It was proof that, no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. I stood up slowly, grabbed my bag, and didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The The humiliation had already been made loud and clear. I walked through the door with my legs shaking, trying not to look back because I knew if I did, I'd see only indifference. The hallway seemed wider than ever. Every step echoed off the walls. I left the office feeling the air outside was heavy, as if even the weather had suddenly changed. It wasn't just the loss of an inheritance. It was something much harder to explain. There, in that old building in downtown Fresno, I learned that some blows leave no visible mark, but they never heal. As much as I wanted to forget, that moment was etched in my memory, as if every detail had been designed to remain forever. They managed to destroy everything in less than 20 minutes. And believe me, from that point on, things would spiral out of control in ways no one in that room could have imagined. You're already feeling the weight of this injustice firsthand. Stories like this change the way we view even our own names. Like now and subscribe, because here each truth exposed is just the beginning of what's to come. And what comes next will shake everything you know about family. I had just walked through the office door, my bag slipping off my shoulder and my head full of questions I couldn't answer, when I heard my name, low and quick, coming from behind. It was Mr. Harris. He didn't have that patronizing air some lawyers try to use when they sense someone is underdog, and this time, his expression was even more closed. I walked up to him, trying to maintain some dignity, even though my legs felt heavy. He held out his hand and, bluntly, handed me a white envelope, thicker than usual, sealed with red wax. My name was written in firm letters, Rachel. Just seeing that handwriting made me hesitate. The smell of the paper, mixed with the smell of the old carpeted hallway, brought back memories of my grandfather teaching me to write properly, always demanding neat handwriting in my experience reports. Mr. Harris spoke softly, almost whispering, staring down the hallway. "It's from your grandfather, Henry. He asked that it be given to you alone. Read it slowly when you're alone. Just you. That was it. No explanation of what was inside. No warning of what to expect." My instinct was to be suspicious. After hearing that it was worthless to the family, I wondered if it was just another reminder of my place, some kind of sick joke, maybe a "get over it and move on" message. I stood there, clutching the envelope tightly, as if it could answer all the questions I'd been holding. I couldn't bring myself to open it right away. I walked slowly out of the building, feeling the texture of the envelope between my fingers, as if each wax mark were a secret waiting to escape. I walked to the parking lot without looking back, weaved past the parked cars, and leaned against the hood of my blue Honda, which was over 12 years old and had almost 200,000 kilometers on it. The engine still made that irregular noise when I turned it off, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. I sat in the passenger seat, closed the door, and stared at the envelope, turning it over in my hands. The dashboard clock read 9:16. It was early, but I was already exhausted. I opened my purse, placed the envelope inside, and took a deep breath. In that moment, every detail seemed more intense. The smell of old leather on the seat, the sun beating down on the glass, the hum of a plane passing overhead. I thought of all the times my grandfather had surprised me, almost always with a discreet smile, a gift hidden in the laboratory, or a note rolled up inside a botany book. But now the silence was different. I wanted to rip the seal right then and there and find out once and for all if this was some kind of test, another weight on my shoulders, or perhaps the last bit of affection from my grandfather. But doubt outweighed curiosity. I stood there, sweat dripping down my back, staring at the envelope sitting in my lap like a grenade about to explode. I didn't know if this would lift me up or completely destroy the little hope I still had that day. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to see if anyone in the family had noticed I was still there, but the parking lot was empty, just 2 cars and the delivery truck across the street. I picked up the envelope, slowly ran my finger over the name, and whispered, "Just for you." Grandfather's handwriting was easy to recognize, large, straight letters without any ornamentation. The red seal was already slightly cracked on one side. It made me wonder if he'd done it in a hurry, or if it was just time messing with the wax. My phone vibrated with a message, but I ignored it. In that moment, it was as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Just the envelope, the silence, and the weight of what it could mean. If it were another prank, I'd have to pick up the pieces again. If it were something else, I wouldn't have a clue how to handle it either. When I opened the car window to breathe, I felt the warm wind on my face and wondered how many times a simple envelope can change the course of a life. There, in that cramped parking lot, holding a sealed piece of paper, I still had no idea how many secrets were about to emerge from the shadows. I sat in the car for over 20 minutes, watching the hands on the dashboard clock tick by, until I finally decided I couldn't put it off any longer. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed down Highway 141, cutting through the dry fields of the San Joaquin Valley, passing rusty signs, almond trees, and stretches of road that always made me feel a strange mix of nostalgia and dread of what I might find upon my return. It had been exactly 362 days since I'd last set foot on the family ranch at 2058 Oak Ridge Avenue, near the old Baptist church that still stood the test of time. Google Maps indicated a 38-minute drive, but I drove slowly, in no hurry to get there. The envelope was still there, untouched in my purse, and every mile I drove seemed to deepen the feeling that I was returning to a place where I was no longer sure I was welcome. The wooden gate was still in place, but the silver numbers had peeled off, and now all I could read was the bottom, 58. I pressed the button on the remote, heard the creak of the iron scraping against the wall, and slowly entered, looking at the two-story house, its beige paint peeling at the corners, and the porch filled with pots my grandmother had always tended. The smell of damp earth mixed with lavender flowers came with it as soon as I parked near the garage. My grandfather's old GMC truck still sat in the shade of the oak tree, covered in dry leaves and accumulated dust. Walking there felt like time had passed more for me than for this place. Before going downstairs, I glanced at the envelope one more time, hoping it might bring me some answer, or at least a reason to face all this. I took a deep breath and walked along the cobblestone sidewalk, noticing the cracks I'd known since childhood. Every detail of the entrance seemed to scream I was back: the worn rug with the initials M&H, Grandma's old boots by the door, and the light on in the kitchen, even though it was just after 10 in the morning. I rang the doorbell, which still made that same off-key sound, and waited. I heard no footsteps. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, or that she simply didn't want to see me. I rang again, this time less patiently, my hand feeling cold even in the heat outside. When the door opened, I was startled by Grandma's face. Margaret looked smaller, her white hair tied in a crooked bun, her skin mottled, and her eyes filled with weariness. She didn't smile, didn't hug me, just stood there studying me for a few seconds, as if trying to understand what had brought me back. I walked past without waiting for an invitation, dropped my bag on the chair in the hallway, and went to the kitchen, where the smell of burnt coffee mingled with that of stale bread. We didn't exchange many words. She continued stirring the kettle, pretending to ignore my presence, and I stood there, staring at the flowered wallpaper that was starting to peel near the ceiling. The Formica table was covered with old newspapers, a few handwritten notes, and an unopened biscuit tin. I sat down and began to notice everything around me: the crooked pictures, the clock stuck at 9:45, the glass jars full of beans on the shelf. It was the same scene as years ago, but at the same time it felt like everything there had been suspended in time since my grandfather's death. As Grandma finished mopping the sink, I remembered the mornings I'd wake up early to help in the barnyard, the afternoons I'd run through the cornfield chasing chickens, the nights I'd sit by the stove listening to Grandpa's stories about the ancient harvests. Now, everything seemed distant, as if there was no longer a place for me there. The sound of the wind hitting the windows brought back a sense of estrangement, as if the house, too, were waiting for answers. I reached into my purse for the envelope but couldn't bring myself to open it. My fear of what I might find there overcame my curiosity. I ran my hand along the table, feeling the roughness of the cracked formica, and thought of how many times I'd wanted to escape that ranch, and now I just wanted, somehow, to belong again. Margaret glanced at me quickly, wiped her hands on her apron, and asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded silently, feeling the weight of the conversation we needed to have, but neither of us was ready to begin. The silence was broken only by the sound of coffee pouring into the mug and the antique clock trying to tick. It was strange to realize that everything there had changed, but the feeling of being lost was exactly the same as before. Every second I spent in that kitchen reminded me of how much that place was full of questions no one wanted to answer. What I didn't imagine was that, in a few hours, some answers would hurt far more than any silence kept over the last 12 months. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee when Grandma's voice cut through the silence of the kitchen, bluntly. "I want to know why you disappeared to the hospital. Why did you leave your grandfather alone when he needed him most?" I was speechless, staring at her as her spoon tapped lightly against the rim of the mug, repeatedly, as if to mark each word. The question came directly, the way she always did, but it hit where it hurt most. I felt my hand suddenly sweat. I'd known this moment was coming, but hearing it from her lips was much harder than I'd imagined. She didn't even wait for an answer. She just continued tidying up, her gaze fixed, as if she were already certain of everything she thought of me. I tried to speak, but all I could manage was a quiet, "It wasn't like that," which she pretended not to hear. I took a deep breath and asked her to stop, to really look at me. She ignored me, but this time I wasn't going to let it go. I remembered every day of those last months at St. Mark's Hospital in Clovis. I'd wake up at 5:50, drive 20 miles there, spend hours with my grandfather, bring him soup, change the TV channel because he hated police shows. The week before last, I'd call and no one would answer. When I tried to visit, they'd say he was too tired to see anyone. I thought it was strange, but I kept insisting until the day before the funeral, Ashley texted me saying I didn't need to worry anymore, because it was over. I asked to check the messages, to find out the funeral time, but no one responded. In the end, I received a text message with the address of the ceremony, but the text was wrong. I ended up at Santa Clara Cemetery, while the family had already finished at Westview Memorial Field. I missed the final goodbye because they trusted me just enough to keep me away from the final moment. That story of abandonment was the version they wanted everyone to hear, not the truth. I looked at Grandma and saw her clutching her apron tightly, saying nothing. I told her everything without skipping a single detail. "They gave Grandpa the wrong phone number, Grandma. They told him I didn't want to visit. It wasn't true. They changed the funeral time, telling him when it was already over. I tried until the last minute, but they did everything they could to keep me from arriving. I went to Grandpa's room and showed her the calls still saved on my phone, the messages that went unanswered, the screenshots of the map pointing to the wrong address. The mood in the kitchen grew tense. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be resolved with an apology or a hug. Grandma dropped the cloth on the table and sat down, finally looking me in the eye. She asked why I'd never told her about it before. I told her I'd tried, but no one would listen. She took a deep breath, taking her time before speaking, and fidgeted with her wedding ring as she processed everything I'd said. The digital clock in the kitchen read 10:53. I remembered how many times that device had beeped during the early hours of the morning, signaling medication times, IV changes, and visits prohibited by the pandemic. I knew that after that morning, nothing would be the same. With each new detail I revealed, Grandma sank deeper into her chair. I asked her if she believed me, and she responded only after several long seconds, staring at the floor, saying she no longer knew what to believe. I didn't expect her to defend me, nor for everything to be resolved overnight. I just wanted someone to finally know what they did to me, and to him. My voice rose higher than usual when I said I was tired of being silenced, of being used as a scapegoat for everything that went wrong in that family. I wanted to know how long I would have to pay for sins I never committed. She closed her eyes, rested her face in her hands, and remained like that for several minutes. No words, no comfort. It was as if the full weight of the lies and pent-up anger had landed there in the kitchen, amid the cold cups of coffee and forgotten breadcrumbs. The room grew so silent she could hear the old television playing the county news in the background. I got up and went to the window, looking outside at the orange trees, almost bare of fruit, the swing my grandfather had made for me with an old rope, now fallen to the ground. The entire ranch seemed to beg for answers no one wanted to give. It was impossible to imagine that, after all this, there was still room for more cutting truths. But each time I turned that gaze to my grandmother, it became clear that there was still so much waiting to be revealed, and I had no idea what was yet to be discovered. The silence in that kitchen seemed endless. Margaret stood motionless for a few minutes, staring at the tabletop, while I remained standing, waiting for some sign of what she intended to do. When she finally stood, she went straight to the old-fashioned telephone on the wall next to the refrigerator, dialing each number slowly, as if confirming each name before completing the call. She spoke little, her words practical. "I want you here at home today at 1 p.m. Don't ask, just come." She repeated the phrase for each call, to my parents, to Ashley, even to Mr. Harris's office, letting me know she wanted everyone present. When she hung up, she returned to staring at the table, breathing deeply, without looking at me. The digital clock flashed 11:39, and I knew the next few hours would be an eternity. Time dragged on. I sat in the living room armchair, the same worn leather one where Grandpa slept on Sunday afternoons. The smell of dust and the marks of his footprints were still there. My head was spinning, full of questions, but I couldn't think of anything other than how this meeting would go. I didn't know if I had the courage to face my parents and Ashley after everything that had been revealed. I fumbled with the still-sealed envelope, unable to find the strength to open it. I watched my grandmother make fresh coffee, pacing around the house as if trying to keep busy. At 12:55, I heard the sound of cars approaching. First, my father's black truck, then Ashley's white SUV with San Diego plates, and finally, Mr. The room filled with footsteps and silence. No one sat together. Everyone chose a corner, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. My father entered, looking at his cell phone. My mother paused in the doorway, her purse still on her shoulder. Ashley walked straight into the kitchen, passing me as if I were invisible. Only the lawyer seemed calm, adjusting his leather briefcase on his lap. Margaret slammed the door shut and called for silence. No one dared to contradict her. Once everyone was there, she spoke in one breath. "Enough lies. Let's settle this now." She ordered everyone to sit around the table, even though the last thing anyone wanted was to be so close. It was then that she asked Mr. Harris to open the briefcase. He pulled out a brown envelope, different from mine, and explained that it was an addendum to the will, a document that, according to Grandpa Henry's final instructions, should only be read if there were any doubts about the division of the inheritance. My father tried to protest. My mother shook her head, but my grandmother didn't let anyone interrupt. The tension was absurd. My hands were freezing, trying to hide it, but feeling every muscle in my body stiffen. The lawyer put on his glasses, read the first few lines to confirm their authenticity, and got straight to the point. By express decision of Henry Whitman, it is hereby recorded that the financial inheritance shall be divided equally between Rachel and Ashley. And further, the entire research laboratory, the Henry Research Annex, shall be given to Rachel's full ownership. My name came out of his mouth in a way I'll never forget. Ashley's eyes widened. My parents exchanged looks of astonishment, and I stood there, unsure whether to believe it or if it was some kind of mistake. The laboratory was my grandfather's greatest pride, built behind the old barn, a white shed with large windows and research equipment purchased over more than 30 years. There, he conducted soil fertility experiments, developed drought-resistant seeds, and taught local children about science. Having it in my hands was more than a material possession. It was all I had to remember him by. Every shelf, every test tube labeled with my teenage handwriting. My father tried to argue, saying I lacked the experience to run a laboratory of that size. But the lawyer was clear. Everything was signed, notarized, and dated. November 17th, 2022, registered with the Fresno City Clerk's office. A sense of justice mixed with anger filled the air. My mother said nothing, but I could see her hands trembling on the table. Ashley opened her mouth to protest, but my grandmother cut her off. He knew what he was doing, and I want to see that decision respected. The atmosphere was so tense that even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower. I stood there, looking at each of them, feeling like everything could fall apart at any moment. But in that moment, for the first time, I realized that maybe there was a place for me in that family, even if it was built on rubble. But not even the best script in the world could prepare anyone for what would come next. I stood in the living room, watching everyone discuss the addendum to the will, but my mind was already elsewhere, trapped in the thick envelope that remained sealed in my bag. It was as if it burned inside the fabric, begging to be opened. I just waited for the right moment, a moment of silence, A break from the raised voices and the eyes that swerved every time I tried to raise my head. When the chaos became unbearable, I grabbed the envelope and went to my grandfather's old bedroom. The room was exactly as he had left it. Botany books stacked on the desk, a worn armchair, a greenish glass lampshade with a cracked base. I sat up in bed, my hands still cold, and finally broke the red seal with my thumb. Inside were several sheets, carefully folded, each in his firm, unhurried handwriting. The first line struck me in a way I hadn't expected. "Rachel, if you're reading this, it's because the truth has finally come out." I paused for a second, trying to hold back tears. Grandfather had never been one to show affection. He was reserved, serious, but what was written there was everything I'd hoped to hear for years. He said he'd always seen the real me, that he'd watched my efforts since I was little, even when it seemed no one noticed. He spoke of the days I'd found myself in the lab alone, studying without being told, and of the times he'd seen me help the community children with science projects, even when I had other commitments. He wrote that he was proud of my courage in not bowing down to anyone, in never giving up on doing what I believed was right, despite all the obstacles that arose in the family. With each paragraph, it became clear that he knew everything that was going on behind closed doors. He said that in recent years, he'd noticed how Ashley and my parents did everything they could to push me away. He said he tried to intervene several times, but that he didn't want to cause more pain, so he decided to trust me, to trust in my strength. He wrote that the decision to leave the lab and his share of the financial inheritance to me was made because he knew I wasn't just after money, but wanted to do something bigger, to turn what I inherited into something that would help others, just as he'd always dreamed. He described the pride he felt watching me tinker with the lab's ancient equipment, recording data in worn notebooks, even correcting the test tube labels. He recounted a Saturday, May 28, 2017, when I spent the entire day cataloging seeds alongside him, while the others were busy with parties or traveling. He remembered the smell of disinfectant on the floor, the sound of rain falling on the tin roof, the muffled laughter when I confused corn with barley on a cultivation chart. Every detail seemed so present that I felt my body relax for a few moments. When he got to the most difficult part of the letter, he didn't mince words. He explained that he'd overheard my mother and Ashley talking about how it would be better to leave me out of important moments, that he'd even heard my father suggesting it would be more practical to cut off contact altogether. He said he knew what they were doing and regretted not having the strength to confront them all at once while he was alive. But he emphasized that even so, he'd done everything he could to ensure I wouldn't leave empty-handed or with my head down. In the end, he apologized for not being more direct, for letting silence fill so many spaces between us, but thanked me for never giving up fighting for what I believed in. "You are the continuation of what I've always dreamed for this lab, for our family. Don't let yourself be swallowed up by resentment. Make the Henry Research Annex a place of open doors, of learning and respect. Promise me you'll let the world know who you are. Your way, not theirs." I rested my forehead on the papers, closed my eyes, and felt a relief I'd never felt in that house. For the first time, I didn't need to make excuses or justify my existence to anyone. My grandfather saw in me everything others pretended not to. It took me a while to get up, afraid to go back to the living room and face the same old faces again. But this was different. I knew that somehow, that letter changed everything, even the way I breathed. But what happened when I returned to the hallway showed that the truth, when it decides to come out, rips everyone's masks off, and not always calmly. I returned to the living room with the letter still in my hands, my skin damp from clutching the paper, and my face hot from being beyond the pale of disappointment. I didn't need to say anything for everyone to realize something had changed. Ashley was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, staring at her own reflection in the glass cabinet. My parents were whispering in the corner, with the tone of someone preparing excuses before even being accused. Mr. Harris was adjusting the folder of documents on his lap, waiting to see where the next attack would come from. I walked straight to the table and stood, not hiding behind any chair. I took a deep breath, feeling my voice threatening to crack, but forced it out firmly. "Do you want to explain, Mom? Or would you rather I show the messages to everyone here?" My mother froze. My father tried to smile, but it came out crooked. Ashley turned her face away, as if the world were too small for her own mistakes. I didn't need to raise my voice. I recounted, in front of everyone, every detail, from the rejected calls from St. Mark's Hospital to the wrong funeral address. I showed the cell phone records, the photos of the messages, every missed call. I spoke of the switched phone number, the last attempt at a stolen goodbye. I felt my palms begin to sweat as I showed the letter, but I kept my arms steady. Grandfather's words echoed in every sentence. If you're reading this, it's because the truth has finally come out. I held nothing back. I spoke of the humiliation of the will, of the small cruelties of everyday life, of the times when people looked at me as if I were a mistake that needed to be fixed. I said, looking each of them in the eye, that I would no longer accept being silenced. My father tried to interrupt, saying it was all an exaggeration, that real family overcomes differences and moves on. My mother stammered that she never wanted to push me away, that she only wanted to protect her grandfather. Ashley, her voice trembling, began to cry, saying she had no idea how much that hurt me. I didn't let it go. I remembered that she was the last one to speak to me before the funeral, that she sent me to the wrong address, that she was quick to pose as the perfect daughter, but didn't hesitate to exclude me when I needed her most. The argument escalated, each trying to deflect blame. The lawyer remained silent, his eyes fixed on the papers. Margaret, until then silent, slowly stood up and slammed her hand down on the table, cutting off any attempt to escape. "Enough," she said. "I've heard enough." My grandmother stared at my parents, then looked at Ashley. She said she'd never admitted a lie in that house, and that what hurt her most wasn't the betrayal, but the cowardice of trying to hide it. She said she'd always known something was wrong, but chose not to see it. Now, with everything out there, exposed, there was no turning back. She turned to my parents, her face hardened by someone who'd spent a lifetime weathering storms, and said, "You can leave." "I don't want any more lies under my roof." Silence was immediate. My parents went pale. Ashley stood up, stunned, and tried to hug her grandmother, but she backed away, saying that respect is earned with truth, not pretense. Watching my family gather their things, one by one, leaving through the front door, was both devastating and liberating. I heard the sound of cars driving away, first Ashley's SUV, then my parents' truck. I looked at Margaret, who was still shaking with anger and disappointment, but I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time: trust. I sat on the porch steps, my back aching as if I'd been carrying bags of cement. The wind was strong that late afternoon, stirring up dust and dry leaves across the yard. I stood there, listening to the creak of the wooden fence, taking a deep breath for the first time in years. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat still, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, something I'd carried since childhood. Margaret sat beside me, silent. She didn't apologize, didn't promise to make amends, but just sat there, sharing the bench with me, both of us staring out at the empty field, as if knowing that certain scars will hurt forever but don't need to be hidden. That house finally felt like a place where I could exist on my own terms. And little did I know that, when the dust from that day settled, my grandfather's laboratory awaited me with more questions than answers. The first night in that house without my parents and Ashley was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The silence felt clean, unburdened by judgments hidden behind closed doors. Grandma Margaret stayed up late, pacing the kitchen, stirring pots and pans, and putting away dishes that were probably already clean. I didn't sleep much. I spent the night sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to believe it had all really happened. Grandpa's envelope, now open, sat on the bedside table, along with my old notebook, the one he gave me in 2006. Back when I only dreamed of understanding how every detail of the laboratory worked. When the sun came up, I grabbed the key to the Henry Research Annex. Just looking at the metal plaque attached to the warehouse gate, the letters faded with age, sent a chill. The smell inside was a mixture of dirt, disinfectant, grease from old equipment, and aged paper. I remembered my grandfather adjusting the microscopes, explaining every button and lens. Most of the equipment was covered with cloth, but nothing was broken, just waiting for a chance to be useful again. I opened the windows and let the light in. I spent hours cleaning, throwing away empty boxes, sorting through test tubes and instruments that, so old, they looked like museum pieces. I found my notebook in a padlocked drawer. Inside were notes from a heat-resistant strawberry breeding project we never finished together. The pages were filled with doodles, diagrams, and even a sketch of an experiment to teach elementary school children how to measure soil pH using colored filter paper. I flipped through each page, remembering how eager I was to show my results to my grandfather, and how he made a point of calmly correcting my mistakes. That morning, alone among test tubes, pipettes, and microscopes, I decided that this laboratory would not just be a memorial to the past. I began the renovation with the little money left after paying off old bills and debts. I bought white paint for the walls, replaced the light bulbs with LEDs, adapted the wooden countertops to accommodate new computers, and made sure to set aside a room just for children's activities. I installed a large whiteboard, bought boxes of colored pencils, and assembled basic science kits, test tubes, simple scales, magnifying glasses, and some used biology textbooks. In the following weeks, I contacted the county public school and a local NGO that served vulnerable children. I proposed a program called the Little Scientist Initiative, a weekly workshop to teach science the way my grandfather dreamed, without excluding anyone, regardless of grade, income, or last name. The response came quickly. At the first workshop, 10 children, ages 6 to 11, showed up, curious, shy, but full of enthusiasm. I taught them how to measure temperature, identify seeds, and conduct simple experiments with recyclable materials. Every smile on their faces reminded me of my grandfather and how he saw potential in anyone willing to learn. Some parents began participating, bringing cakes and coffee, and helping set up the workbenches. Little by little, the lab filled with new voices, colorful paintings, and jars filled with soil samples collected from neighboring yards. Margaret decided to move in with me after a few months. She took over the old guest room, redecorated it with old family photos, and began tending the backyard garden, replanting herbs and flowers. Between cups of tea, she told me stories about the time when the ranch was just a patch of land and promise. We still argued sometimes, but now there was respect, comfortable silence, and a sense that it was possible indeed to rebuild a family from the right pieces. At the end of each week, I would close the lab and write down, on the last page of my notebook, the children's progress and my own questions. It wasn't easy. Resources were scarce, time was always short, but for the first time, I felt that my grandfather's legacy hadn't just been an act of justice. It was an opportunity to build a different future, not just for me, but for so many people who, like me, just needed to be seen to start dreaming. And without even realizing it, I was creating a new kind of family, one where everyone had space to exist as they were, without needing to ask anyone's permission. Time passed faster than I expected. In just a few years, the Henry Research Annex went from being just a renovated warehouse to a county benchmark for science education and sustainable agriculture projects. The number of children passing through grew so much that I had to enlist the help of volunteer teachers and even establish partnerships with the local college. The city sent representatives to visit the project, and one day, I received a plaque of recognition signed by the mayor, something my grandfather would have proudly hung right at the entrance. The Little Scientist Initiative was featured in the Fresno newspaper, and whenever I read the articles, I remembered Saturday afternoons cataloging seeds and the strong smell of alcohol in the old laboratory's glassware. Margaret, despite aging rapidly in recent years, made a point of attending every workshop. Even on days when she forgot a neighbor's name, she never forgot the smell of freshly brewed coffee or the cornbread she brought to the children at the end of class. The laboratory became a meeting place. Entire families began visiting the ranch on weekends. At Christmas, we organized small science fairs, and every child took home a plant seedling or an experiment they'd made with their own hands. For the first time, I felt the weight of the past give way to a kind of peace that only exists when we know we're living the right way. On a rainy Tuesday in September, almost 5 years after that morning when everything changed, I saw a rental car pull up in front of the laboratory gate. I thought it was just another lost supplier trying to deliver cleaning supplies, But when I opened the door, there was Ashley. She seemed smaller than I remembered. Her hair tied back in a simple bun, understated clothing, and a weary expression. For a moment, I thought it was a quick visit, one of those just to check in, shake hands, show she was all sorted. But no. She entered with her head down, asked to speak privately. I closed the office door, offered her a chair, and sat opposite, trying to remain calm. It wasn't an easy conversation. Ashley, between pauses and teary eyes, apologized. She admitted she had let her parents get the better of her, that she was ashamed of what she did to me and her grandfather, that she spent years trying to escape her own reflection, but could never forget what she did. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted to try to be better, for herself and for the children she now saw sitting in the same chairs where we had both learned so much. I confess I considered sending her away. The memory of the humiliation, the lies, the stolen years of my life with my grandfather all came flooding back in a flash. But I looked at her thin, trembling hands and remembered the letter, her grandfather's words about never letting resentment swallow up all that was true. I took a deep breath and told her that if she really wanted to make a difference, she should start by washing the children's lab coats and helping sort recyclables. It wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation to silently prove that she was willing to learn from her own shame. She accepted without protest. For the next month, Ashley returned every week. She learned how to assemble science kits, helped tend the potted plants, sat next to children who could barely read, and showed that, yes, there was still room for a new beginning. Little by little, the scars between us changed shape. They didn't disappear, but they were no longer open wounds. The routine changed. Margaret, now more fragile, began calling Ashley my other granddaughter again. On Sundays, the three of us would sit on the porch, talking little, sharing slices of cake and hot tea, watching the children run around the field. The lab became a symbol of everything I had managed to build from the family's rubble. Awards came, invitations to lectures, testimonials from grateful parents, letters from children who said they wanted to be scientists, like Rachel from the annex. In every detail of everyday life, from the test tubes filled with soil to the laughter of a child discovering how a leaf changes color, I felt that my grandfather's true legacy wasn't in inheritance, laboratory work, or money. It was in never giving up on being who I was. To this day, I wear his wristwatch, all scratched up, with its faded leather strap. Every time I look at the time, I remember what he wrote. Make the Henry Research Annex a place of open doors. No matter how much time passes, how many fights, how many reconciliations, what truly remains is learning. Each morning, that being true to who I am is worth more than any recognition. And that's the kind of legacy no one can steal. By now, you understand what it means to fight for your own name, to start over from scratch, and to refuse to accept the role others have tried to impose on you. What happened here isn't just a story. It's a direct invitation to every person who still believes they don't deserve a place, who has been silenced, who has had to rebuild when the world seemed to fall apart. The true legacy of the Henry Research Annex was never in the money, the renovated walls, or the recognition plaques. It's in every difficult choice, in every downfall, and, most importantly, in every time someone decides to be true to themselves, even when it means facing all kinds of pain and abandonment. Now I want to hear from you. Faced with so much pressure, would you have the courage to rebuild everything, even without guarantees? Write in the comments. I choose to be authentic, no matter what. I want to see who is truly ready to live this truth, without filters, without excuses. Stories like these resonate with us because they expose what's most human in us, the search for belonging, justice, and meaning. You felt this weight because somewhere deep inside you, this story is yours too. Like this post now. Here, each story is an open scar, a real lesson in courage. And every time you comment, share, or like, this story reaches someone who may be experiencing the same dilemma. You're already part of this legacy just by getting this far. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Here, every week, you'll encounter stories that push boundaries, tear down masks, and show, in practice, that no one is destined to fail. This community exists because real stories change lives, unite people who've never met before, and prove that behind all pain, there's room for a new beginning. Don't leave now. What you've experienced today is just the beginning. The next video is already on screen, and I guarantee you're not prepared for what's coming. Click now and discover what happens when the impossible decides to defy logic. Just don't say I didn't warn you.